Yeah.
All right. Welcome, Dr. Elin, to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we're happy to have you today. You have a really interesting background and research experience regarding blood sugar, and I would love to hear your story and your background and how you got into the health world.
Yeah. So I guess I was already, quite early on interested in the health space, or at least in, the medical field. And I wanted to start with to become a doctor, I think. But, when choosing your education and looking at alternatives, I realized that I really wanted to be more on the preventative side rather than the treating side of things. So I ended up studying actually food science and nutrition and some biotechnology aspects of life. And it felt really right for me. And I came into then when I was looking I found this PhD position, which I started, that it was really on the border between, preventative, doing research with people, taking their blood sugar levels, checking what food do to your blood sugar. And it felt so right. So I was really happy to find that area actually and find that position. So that's when I started to connect with the blood sugar field and also the fermenting of foods, which I was working with at the time.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So what types of experiments and things were you doing in your lab taking blood sugar? What were some things that you were looking at? Because I love doing my own self-experiments with my continuous glucose monitor. And I think so many other people are waking up to this, that, oh my goodness, we have this individual reaction to how a food affects us and we can measure it. It's so cool. So what were the types of things that you guys were looking at?
Yeah, so I actually started my PhD about 20 years ago now. So a lot have happened during those years, of course. Yeah. We were at the technical faculty, which means that we didn't really have access to patients. Mm-hmm. So we worked with, students and apparently healthy people that wanted to be volunteer for our studies. And we always used, finger pricking for measuring capillary glucose. And also we were also almost always looking at the insulin levels, because it's important to understand not only what happens with glucose, but also insulin, especially in research. So we also took, actually to start with, we took also a little bit bigger blood samples from the fingers to measure insulin. But later on, we started taking venipuncture instead to take it from the arm. So we have, we have worked with this classical glycemic index testing, if you will. So it is standardized that you have to bring people in the lab. It should be the same person that comes back several times to eat the different meals that you are comparing with each other. And you should have a reference that is either pure glucose, then like GTT, or white bread. And most of the time we used white bread because it's more realistic. It's more like a matrix to it. It's not just a glucose solution that you gulp. So that was the kind of studies, very, very academic we did. And we worked a lot with bread as a vehicle, I would say, to put different fibers, different structures, also going in a little bit to proteins, but mainly around the structures and fibers, I would say, in the bread. But we also looked at then fermented foods, like we made some sourdough bread, we made some fermented, more gruel type, porridge type of products. We looked at some pickled vegetables, which also had some acids to them. And we used vinegar. I have done quite a few studies on, the effects of vinegar on blood sugar regulation as well. So we had these different, more experimental products that we created more or less in the lab. So not always that tasty and palatable and good looking, but they could serve the purpose for our research.
Awesome. That's so interesting. And so I would love to hear some of the results. You don't have to tell us in detail, but some takeaways from some of these studies I like that it's funny to me that you're using white bread as like a control, as, in replace of a glucose solution. Just goes to show you how much that has an impact on blood sugar, white bread in general, because it just turns to sugar in our mouths because of the digestive enzymes that we have. So as you chew, if you chewed a piece of bread or some rice long enough, it starts to get sweet because those salivary amylases, which are digestive enzymes, start breaking down those starches in the mouth and making them turn into sugar, right? So can you tell us some of the takeaways from these different food types, the fibers, the fermentation, because I think that sounds super interesting.
Yeah, so I think in general there, I mean, working with structures. So as you say, you know, long chains of glucose, which is starch, is more or less the same as having a glucose solution, although it needs some digestion in the body. So there is a conversion factor if you use glucose versus bread when you express the glycemic index, if you want to use that measure. So, but we use bread, as I said, and it's really rapidly broken down. So it's not too good for your blood sugar, of course, and most people know that by now. That's why it's a reference. So structure, if you're talking about bread, which we were focusing a lot on, I mean, the structure is really important. So we have this, you know, in our part of the world, we have this really dense, high amount of kernels, intact kernels, like rye bread. And then you have also pumpernickel bread, which also have, you know, kernels, and it's also baked with a certain principle, which also adds to it and make it more or less digestible, if you say. I mean, it takes longer to digest it. So when it comes to bread, if people want to eat bread, you should, of course, go to those very coarse versions where you have a lot of intact material in there, intact cereals, and also the nuts and seeds, of course. So that was something we worked quite a bit with. We also know that it's possible from, I mean, there are soluble fibers, for example, like some of the beta glucans that you can find in oats and barley. That can be added in a more, refined, if they're smart, produced in a smart way, they can be actually quite white, but still have a good effect on blood sugar. So you can add them to bread and make it still look pretty white and have a very good effect on your blood sugar. So there is a lot to do if we wanted to improve bread, which I think is a challenge for the industry. But we can have a separate conversation on that maybe. And then, so that was about the bread. Then fermentation per se. So the presence of organic acids like lactic acid or acetic acid, they are good, and they have some different mechanisms as far as I could evaluate in my research. So having a lactic acid, which is the most prominent when you do sourdough baking, I could see in my research that it has to be there during the heating of the starch. So having sourdough with it from the beginning and then heating the starch, you will have some interactions created during the gelatinization of the starch. That means that it will take longer time for the digestive system to degrade that bread. So even a white sourdough bread, white wheat sourdough bread, if it has, you know, a sour taste, so you can really say that it's been baked with a real sourdough, it is better for the blood sugar because it takes longer to digest. And we could look at that actually in microscope to see the starch granules, how much they had swollen and things like that. So that was pretty interesting. What we then know from the acetic acid and the vinegar research is that it has a slightly different mechanism. So vinegar is actually acting on your gastric emptying rate rather. So it helps you slow down the rate of gastric emptying, so the food comes at a slower pace to the upper intestines where it's absorbed. So, and then you have the fermentation in general. I mean, fermentation is a very good way of not only preserving food, of course, which has been used traditionally, but also releasing some of the maybe bound material bioactives that are, we call them sometimes co-passengers with the fibers. Minerals and vitamins and good antioxidants and everything, they can be released more if you ferment your food in different ways. So it's a way of increasing the bioavailability of things.
That's really interesting. So I feel like a big takeaway that I'm pulling out of your research is that the longer a food takes to digest and absorb, the better on the blood sugar. Is that a simple takeaway from this?
I would absolutely say so, because and people say, oh, so a lot of food will go, maybe carbs will go undigested through the system, but rather it is, I mean, it's such a long passage anyway, where we have possibility to take up the starch and whatever. So it's just the pace that it's taken up that will be slower, but eventually you will probably take it up anyway, but at a very much better pace, and you avoid the big spikes. So So those are actually the two mechanisms I find most useful. And so there are these two places where things can occur. You can either slow down the gastric emptying, or you can slow down the actual digestion. And that's also where the beta glucans come in, because they create this kind of jelly content in the intestine, which makes it really hard for the amylases to be able to reach every glucose molecule. And that means that it also takes longer time for the sugar to rise. So
yeah, that's really interesting. So could you explain why it is that it's better for the blood sugar for it to take longer? So let's say the same amount of sugar dripped out over a longer period of time. Why is that better than all at once?
So it has to do with the insulin regulation, I would say. So actually, if you get a big hit on your glucose, a big increase in glucose rapidly, the body's reacting, sending out insulin, and overshoots the insulin response, because it cannot manage the level the right amount of insulin. So all of a sudden you shot out all this insulin, and the glucose starts to decrease, and there is too much insulin, and then you drop too down, and I mean down too low. Yeah. So it's this exaggeration in insulin that is negative. That's the most negative thing. And of course the crash that you get as well. So by doing it slowly, the body can release the amount of insulin that is needed for that particular glucose dose.
Interesting. So yeah, so we get a smaller amount of insulin, a smaller, more exact amount of insulin. And I have spoken extensively with someone who has type 1 diabetes, and she talks about Dr. Bernstein's book and his The Diabetes Solution. And she talks about his idea of, he calls it the law of small numbers. And so with type 1 diabetics, if they just eat a small amount of glucose, then they need to give themselves a small amount of insulin, and then the margin for error is much smaller. And so we can take this to someone with a functioning pancreas, where we say that, okay, we have a pancreas doing this. So if it's a giant amount of sugar, the pancreas is like, oh my goodness, we need a lot of insulin. Like there's a lot of sugar going on. So it's just going to put out a crazy amount, right? And so I think that the same thing is actually happening with non-type 1 diabetics as well. So then if it's like, oh, it's a small amount of glucose, I got this. And so the margin for error is much smaller. So we don't have that over-exaggerated spike, which leads to that inevitable crash if we eat something really fast. So besides foods with fibers and foods that have been fermented and vinegars, because we know that those are going to slow down the absorption of the sugar, they're going to slow the gastric emptying, etc. What are some other types of foods and things that you want to keep in mind when you're eating food to get a better blood sugar response, and then those that you really want, things that you want to avoid in certain foods?
Yeah, if I go for the things you should think about to add, I think at the end of my university time, we started to work more on spices. So it's also very interesting to look at the spices, and of course, the antioxidative capacity of many of the spices. We looked at things like ginger and turmeric and cinnamon and black pepper and things like that, and they have, of course, a lot of positive benefits, and they are kind of traditionally known in one sense, but we started to look more into scientifically to them, and we actually added them as a drink before the meal. So it's a little bit of, again, the same thinking as with the vinegar, maybe, that you can add components, chemical components actually from these spices that help slow down the whole digestion of the meal. So I think, but also, of course, adding the spices, that was an experimental way of doing it. So adding spices to your meal is also good and helping out, because it acts on many different levels in the body. So that is one area, I think, try to use more spices. And then, of course, we had this line of research on the proteins and amino acids. And that's where we found, and actually that is interesting, where we started that work. And it comes from this view we had of looking at both glucose and insulin. So we saw early on in one of my first studies looking at fermented milk products, I could conclude that well, most milk products are giving quite low glucose responses, maybe even a little bit less if they are fermented, but all of them give rise to high insulin responses, which was surprising at the time. So if we had only measured the glucose responses, we would not have known that insulin was spiking.
Wow,
So that
that's
was the
a
whole
really
round for, yeah, it was actually a side finding because it was not what we were looking for. It was like, oh, look at this, it's 3 times higher insulin than we would have expected from the glucose response, actually.
Wow. And that was with all dairy products or most dairy products that you
No,
tested?
we had like one normal regular milk, 1.5% fat, I believe. And then we had a kind of sour milk that we have, a fermented product we have here in Sweden. And then another sour milk. So I would say that the difference between those fermented milks and the regular milk was maybe, 10 to 15 glycemic index units, but still in the very low range. But the insulin levels were about the same as white bread. So it was very high.
That's wild.
So we were like, okay, how is this? So we actually, it was not part of my original thesis. So we started another thesis looking into what is doing this in milk. And we found out, and so we started to look at the proteins in milk then. So we separated the whey and the casein, and we compared it to some other protein sources like fish protein and gluten protein as well. And we could conclude that if you have the whey protein with a carb source, you would see the same thing almost as with the whole milk. So it's probably the whey proteins that are responsible for this. And we also looked into the blood's levels of amino acids after taking these meals. And we could conclude that there are 5 amino acids showing up very rapidly in the bloodstream when you have a meal with whey, more so than after the other proteins. So that's when we could conclude that, okay, so these 5 amino acids must have play a big role in this effect. So we actually took those 5 amino acids and gave to people in drinks, and we saw that we could mimic the effect of the whey. So we could see a glucose lowering effect, but still a quite big insulin response, which is not what we would like. So that was when we started, we looked at many aspects of proteins, hydrolyzed proteins, and different amounts and all of that. And we also came into the timing. When are you supposed to take these amino acids to get a good effect on your meal? And we found out that having a bolus dose of amino acids just before starting your meal is really helpful for bringing down the glucose response, and also actually for not exaggerating the insulin response that much. So that was one thing we looked at, the timing. And then we thought, okay, but we need another factor as well here to see if we can get rid of this high insulin overall. And we looked at different minerals, and we found out that chromium is very good for improving insulin sensitivity. So it makes the action of the insulin more efficient. So that was when we found out that this combination is really good for holding, pressing down the glucose after the meal and also keeping the insulin levels down.
Wow.
So that was actually the long start and birth of our product that we have today.
Yeah, I was like, this is sounding just like Good Idea. So can you tell us, so Good Idea is a drink that I've been talking about a lot. I've been sharing it on my social media, and you are actually the creator and founder of it. So it sounds exactly like the what is in the drink. So why don't you tell us, you told us a little bit of like you said, the backstory. So tell us more about it.
Yeah. So the cool thing I would say with Good Idea is, of course, that you can drink something with your meal that will influence the glycemic response of that meal. So that's how we do our studies. You have the same meal with and without Good Idea, and you can see an effect on the blood sugar regulation, and you can lower the blood sugar by about 25%. So if we go back to this discussion about the insulin and glucose regulation in the blood, what happens when you drink a few sips of Good Idea before your meal is actually that you signal to your insulin producing cells that, okay, food is about to show up. We better release some of our insulin now so we're ready. So, there is a certain small amount of insulin stored in the cells that can be released immediately. So that is what we think happens And then when you start your meal, when glucose starts to rise, the insulin is already, is already there to take care of the increase. So we avoid this spike that you may get from a meal. And then you have the chromium there to assist with, taking care of the fuel and also improving the efficiency of your insulin. So overall, there is no increase in insulin during this 2-3 hour period after your meal, but you get this little burst just in the beginning, which is very helpful.
Interesting.
So that is how the product works as we see it. And we have done quite a few studies. And from where we started, when we found out this combination of amino acids and chromium, we've actually put down the dosage of the amino acids. So we are now at 2.6 grams of amino acids and 250 micrograms of chromium picolinate. So it's not a big dose even. It's really marginal to your diet.
Yeah, really interesting. Well, it is. So I've had it. I have a bunch in my fridge. I love it. I love the flavors of them. So it's a sparkling water beverage that you drink, you said, a little bit before the meal. Is there a specific amount before the meal you drink?
So when we have tested it, we have asked people to drink about a third of the can, maybe. Just a few minutes, maybe up to 5 minutes before eating. So just when you're about to sit down or when you've sat down before you start to eat your meal, just gulp in some sips.
Yeah.
And then you finish it off with the rest of your meal. So that's how we have tested it. And that's the best way, I would say.
Perfect. And have you tested it with people with like type 2 diabetes? And, have you seen any differences in that sort of population?
So we haven't done any formal studies in any type of diabetic, so we cannot really say what it does. We have several anecdotes though from people that have tried it, both type 1 and type 2 diabetics. So I advise everyone to try, but they should of course consult with their doctor or nurse first to make sure there is nothing that it interferes with whatever they're doing.
Right.
But from the type 1 community, I think there are quite a few people have experienced that they are if they take the same amount of insulin that they would drop a bit quicker in glucose because their insulin will be more efficient from the chromium probably.
Interesting.
So that is something to look out for if you make a trial in your kids or on yourselves. So ideally, that would mean that they could use less insulin if they used Good Idea along with their meals. But that's nothing we have proof of. It's just anecdotes and speculations.
Right.
And in type 2 diabetes as well, we have also got good anecdotes from people using it, and they use it in some different ways. Either they drink it between meals or with meals, and I think in general it may improve their insulin sensitivity to some extent. But as you know as well, type 2 diabetes is a quite varied community. There are many different types within the type 2. So I would say that it would probably also matter what kind of type 2 you have. So but there shouldn't be any problem of trying it out.
Yeah, I do have a population of people that I work with who have reactive hypoglycemia, where their blood sugar is crashing after a meal, or postprandial syndrome. And a lot of them report that they are crashing as they're eating. It's as soon as they start eating, their blood sugar starts crashing. Do you have any insight on this, why this might be?
No, I couldn't really say in any detail. I think there is a lot to learn. I think this is a field that is really emerging more and more right now, and more people are looking into it. I guess there must be some irregularities in the hormone, between the insulin and glucagon, somehow how it reacts to the meal situation. It moves too quickly into I don't know. Or it takes too long to get into the postprandial phase. I'm not sure about that, but I do believe that if you can, in general, improve your blood glucose balance, it should help you. But I don't have any proof for that.
Right.
It makes a lot of sense to try to balance, in general, to also try to avoid those situations.
Yeah. And so just some of the tips that you were saying earlier with the fibers, the fermented foods, the vinegars, I feel like these things could be extra helpful for that sort of population, because if they're having an insulin release very fast, or I think that delaying the gastric emptying could possibly help, or maybe they need something faster. I don't know. Everyone is so different, right? So for some people, I feel like it may help. And then others, we have yet to discover, unfortunately.
Yeah, but I really think, I mean, the main message is really, listen to what happens in your body. It's different for everyone. Mm-hmm. And what works for one may not work for the other. So, but I really think that this trying to put something down there to start with that will, put a little break on the uptake of everything should be helpful for most people, because it will, give the body a chance to do its job in a more controlled way.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially avoiding some of those really high spiking foods, things that are turning into glucose right away. Yeah.
So we are, of course, playing with a good idea. We are playing on the fact that these amino acids in free form in the drink will actually just, be super rapidly taken up from the gut, because there are so many different mechanisms to absorb proteins. So that is signaling then to these insulin producing cells that they should get to work.
Yeah.
And I also think of it as, having some proteins before your carbs. So that's also the way, meal order and trying to eat in the right order and wait a little bit more with the carbs. So actually having some amino acids that will trigger probably the same effect as having some, vegetables or olives or whatever good appetizers before you start your meal.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing I was thinking is that there are certain products on the market, certain supplements that have a blend of amino acids that if someone has blood sugar that doesn't stay stable between meals, like you start crashing in the middle, like in between meals, and the thought is you give a few of these amino acids and it can help kind of stabilize the blood sugar a little bit, because what it can do is as it's dropping, you're getting the amino acids and it's, they could be converting to glucose via gluconeogenesis, but not so much that they're giving a spike. So it sort of has this stabilizing effect. And I feel that good idea would could potentially be a tool for someone who does have these hypoglycemic tendencies between meals. Have you ever seen it used like that?
I haven't personally, but it makes a lot of sense, yes, to give something a little bit of stimulus if you're on your way to crash, or if you have a problem there in between the meals. Yeah, it might very well do. I mean, the biggest factor would be to try really to balance overall with your meals to avoid those episodes. But yeah, I think that would make sense, because it's a rapid form of I mean, it will be rapidly taken up, so it may very well do that.
Yeah, and I think that also,
and it also gives the mere the carbonation, the flavor. It gives you some satiation as well, which I think could also be good for people, just to have something as a little in between meals.
Absolutely,
they crave something.
Yeah, so it could definitely be, when I was doing a lot of fasting, having some sort of a fizzy drink like a club soda or a mineral water could definitely has that satiating effect. So that could be really helpful as well. But also just the addition of the electrolytes in there as well. So Good Idea also has these electrolytes, and a lot of people who experience hypoglycemia, because this is a big population I work with, their adrenal glands are just dumping minerals. They're sort of burning through. And so they really often lack a lot of minerals. And so getting the adrenal support from the electrolytes, getting the insulin sensitizing benefits of the chromium, and then some amino acids to sort of pull that blood sugar up. I see that for someone with hypoglycemia or reactive hypoglycemia, it could be a really, really helpful tool between meals as well as with the meal. So I'm excited to see people use it for this new purpose, because I think it could be a really great tool in the box. So are you still, right. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know. I just wanted to say that. So we have moved on also in my research for, going more into the continuous glucose monitors, which will also help us understand much more what happens between meals. So I think there is we will learn a lot going forward about also the over the day and over the week effects.
Yeah. I can't wait to hear more research that comes out about the use of this. So I hope that could be a good idea if anyone's struggling with that, getting a little lightheaded, dizzy, shaky, anxious, hangry between meals. It might be a good idea to have one of those with you instead of, a granola bar, which is going to spike you and crash you. Right. So having a good idea instead, that could be awesome. So are you working on any other research, anything that you're sort of looking at now?
So no, mainly, for Good Idea, we are looking into making more longer term studies. So we will probably do it a little bit in steps. So we have my pilot study with the CGM, only with 6 people, to learn more how to set up such a study. And then we hope to expand that to maybe 25 or 30 people. And then maybe we can go into different directions, look at people with metabolic syndrome, and then maybe also go in to make trials in type 1 and type 2. So we have, we really would like to understand how this helps in different categories or cohorts of people.
Yeah.
So that is what we're looking at going forward. And then, of course, eventually we would like to do a longer, really long-term study in a big group or many groups to see what it can do for health in the longer term.
Awesome. And where can people find out more about you, what you're working on, or your products?
Yeah, so Good Idea, if you're in the US, you look at goodidea.us, and then we have in Sweden, we have goodidea.se for Sweden, and you find us in social media, and we're also on LinkedIn. So we try to, publish new findings and things on our websites, of course. So we are available in all of US online, in some retail and other parts in Southern California to start with. Yeah. And then in Sweden, we're also now just launching online and in some local stores here. So we are building up slowly.
Awesome. Well, I absolutely love Good Idea. If you all haven't tried it, I will share my link and my promo code in the show notes with you all. It's goodidea.us. And if you're in Sweden, goodidea.se. And I know I have listeners all over the world, so I definitely want to make sure to include this Swedish link as well.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And
we hope also to expand, of course, in the Nordics and then in Europe as soon as possible. So so keep an eye out on our social media.
Absolutely.
Sure. And feel free, please, if you can post my email, or people are very welcome to reach out with questions or.
Absolutely. I'll post that as well. And thank you so much for coming on and for sharing all your findings and for doing this hard work in the labs. Like, this is where we get our recommendations from. I'll say, like, have vinegar with your meal, or have, your vegetables first because of the fibers. And it's like, you're the one doing the work that is telling us why this is beneficial. So thank you so much for your contributions and for sharing and for these great insights that'll definitely help a lot of people. So thanks for coming.
Thank you for doing the great work of bringing it out to people, because that's also an important job.
Yeah, it's a wonderful synergy, right?
Yeah, it is. We all need it.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much. Take care.